Good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Brook, and I am chair of the history department at York University, which is a co-sponsor of this wonderful event. First of all, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. Though we are meeting in virtual space, we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As I said, I'd like to welcome you all to this event, and I will now introduce the president of York University, Rhonda Lenton. President Lenton.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir, bonjour, shalom. I am delighted to see so many of you this evening. I see the numbers continuing to click up. It's very impressive. For those of you who are not part of the York University community, I do want to welcome each of you virtually to York. I hope that one day, very soon, we will have a chance to meet actually on one of our campuses. I want to extend a special welcome and thank yous to a few individuals. Thank you, of course, to Sarah Horowitz and David Goffman, who are core members of the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, for their work in organizing this evening's events. Carl Ehrlich, director of CJS, and all of those that are here from the center. I also want to thank all of the co-sponsors for their support of these important conversations. And of course, our distinguished panelists and authors, Ayelet, David, Norman, and Nessa, who we look forward to hearing from shortly. In 2019, I co-authored a landmark study of the Canadian Jewish community with my husband, Robert Brim, from the University of Toronto and in the Embryonics Institute for Survey Research. And I want to share just two findings with you that resonate with me personally. When we asked Canadian Jews how they personally identify as Jewish, they responded in many different ways. 22% said that they identify as Jewish mainly as a matter of culture. And aside from having my children, I would say that I identify predominantly when I think about being Jewish through culture. And another 33% answered that equally were culture, ancestry, and religion. The second finding I wanted to share with you was that we discovered, among other things, that literature and history are vital elements of Jewish identity in this country. Thus, when choosing a fiction or nonfiction book to read, 70% of Canadian Jews are frequently or occasionally attracted to works that contain a Jewish theme. Moreover, about the same percentage of Canadian Jews claim that preserving the memory of our greatest historical tragedy, the Holocaust, is essential to being Jewish. Calling us the people of the book is thus a misnomer. We are the people of many books, most especially books of literature and history. I know that our panelists will be providing a very informative and rewarding discussion this evening. Before I conclude, I just want to thank the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, not just for their work in creating spaces for important conversations, but for their long-standing leadership in this sector. The center is Canada's first interdisciplinary research center in Jewish studies, and it brings together a vibrant community of scholars and teachers to promote programming and research that enriches the York community and far beyond. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech. Toda.
Thank you so much, Professor President Lenton, for those wonderful words of introduction, and to you too, Professor Brooke. I'm David Kaufman. I'm the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. I welcome you all to our panel. The genesis for this event was Norm actually sending me a copy of his new book, so thank you, Norm. I thought it would be fun and engaging to pull together a panel of esteemed and brilliant and gifted writers, and to bring my colleague Sarah Horowitz on board so that we have one historian and one literature scholar interviewing our top choice for panelists. I'm very pleased that you all made it. So thank you, Norm and Ayelet and Nessa and David in advance for agreeing to come talk with us tonight. We have 4 writers who all deal, at least in part, with Canadian Jewish historical fiction, which is our theme for the evening. Writers who, taken together, speak of Canadian and modern Jewish life as expats, as migrants, as travelers. And so I'm thrilled to take advantage of the obliteration of geographic space that the webinar format allows, so that our panelists and of course all of you, our audience, could be together with us tonight from far and wide. So here's how things are going to work tonight. Sarah and I will lead our panelists through some themes and questions that most interest us. Along the way, our panelists will read an excerpt from one of their works, which is something that we ask them to choose and prep ahead of time. And later on, we'll be glad to take questions from the floor. So if you have a question, I would encourage you to type it in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Sarah and I will do our best to curate some new directions that come from all of you. And I would like to welcome Sarah. Sarah.
Thank you, David, and thank you, of course, to our 4 wonderful authors who are going to make this evening, certainly for me and for all of you. These 4 writers are people who I feel I have lived with, in the sense that their books are in my home, and I've immersed myself in their language, in their words, and in their worlds for long periods of time. I want to thank, before we open up the program, I want to thank our partners in this, the people who helped us make this program possible. Specifically, I'd like to thank for their support the Department of History, the Department of English and Creative Writing, the Department of Humanities, the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies, and the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York University. As well, I want to thank the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, and of course, the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York. I'm going to introduce the authors now one by one, and after that we're going to engage in conversation with them. One of the wonderful things about each of these authors is that not only have they reached so many of us through their own writing, but each of them in different ways has done wonders in nourishing and nurturing the works of other writers. So I'm going to introduce them in, why not, alphabetical order. And I'll start with our first guest, David Bezmosjes, who's an award-winning writer and filmmaker. He's the author of the short story collections Immigrant City and Natasha and Other Stories, and of the novels The Betrayers and The Free World. His books have been nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Governor General's Award, the Trillium Prize. His books have won the Amazon CA First Novel Award and the National Jewish Book Award. He has a number of times been a winner, a recipient of the Vine Canadian Jewish Book Award. In the summer of 2010, David was included in the New Yorker's 20 Under 40 issue, a special issue that celebrated the 20 most promising fiction writers under the age of 40. He is a graduate of the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, and his first feature film, Victoria Day, premiered in the competition at the Sundance Film Festival in 2009. His second feature film was an adaptation of his story, Natasha. He was born in Riga, Latvia, and he now lives in Toronto, where he serves as the creative director of the Humber School for Writers. Next, I'd like to introduce Nessa Rappaport, who who is a native Torontonian, although she now lives in New York with her husband, the artist Toby Kahn. Her new novel, Evening, was published in September by Counterpoint Press. It's the story of two sisters in their 30s and their secrets, set in a Shiva house as one sister grieves for the other. Evening has been chosen by several best books for fall lists, including Vogue, Medium, LitHub, Entertainment Weekly, Chicago Review of Books, Hey Alma, etc. And it's been praised in a starred Publishers Weekly review, in the Globe and Mail, in the Toronto Star, in Booklist, in Shondaland, in Haaretz, Hadassah, Jewish Journal, and the podcast Call Your Girlfriend. Nessa is the author of an earlier novel, Preparing for Sabbath, as well as a collection of prose poems, A Woman's Book of Grieving, that contains lino cuts by Rochelle Rubinstein. She's also the author of a memoir, House on the River, A Summer Journey, which was awarded a grant by the Canada Council of the Arts. Together with Ted Solotaroff, Nessa edited the Shokin Book of Contemporary Jewish Fiction. She speaks frequently on Jewish culture and imagination. Next, I'd like to introduce Norm Raven, whose recent book of Poland and Vancouver is called The Girl Who Stole Everything. That novel was launched, along with other Canadian books, at the Dom Literatury in Lodz, Poland. He's published 3 other novels, including The Joyful Child and Lola by Night, which was translated into Serbian. And he's also published a short story collection called Sex, Skyscrapers, and Standard Yiddish. He won the Ontario Arts Council K.M. Hunter Prize for that. His nonfiction is collected in Hidden Canada, an intimate travelogue, and also in A House of Words, Jewish Writing, Identity, and Memory. And I think it's fair to say that Norm Raven has had a really strong role in shaping the way we understand Canadian Jewish literature. Right now, he's at work on a memoir of Jewish immigration to Canada from Poland in the early 1930s. Norm was born in Calgary, and now he lives in Montreal and teaches at Concordia University. And finally, Ayelet Sabari was born in Israel to a large family of Yemeni descent. She is the author of The Art of Leaving, a memoir which was the finalist for the Writers' Trust Hilary Weston Prize, and the winner of the Canadian Jewish Literary Award in the category of memoir. And it was also an Apple Books and Kirkus Review Best Book of 2019. Her first book, a collection of short stories, The Best Place on Earth, won the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, as well as the Edward Louis Wallant Award. It was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and it has been published internationally. Ayala teaches creative writing at the University of King's College, MFA program in creative nonfiction, and she teaches also at Tel Aviv University. So welcome, welcome, welcome to our authors.
Wonderful. Nice to see your faces, all of you. I'd like to begin by asking Norm Raven if you would read a passage for us.
Thanks, David and Sarah, for setting us up. We appreciate it. I have a book which is set partly in Poland and partly in Vancouver. And the characters, 2 of them end up there in Poland, 2 of the Canadians, by the end of the novel. And the 2 short snippets that I'll read first follow a woman named Nadia on her way from Vancouver to a little place called Radzanov, which is nicely for us up on the screen. That's a kind of a standard type of Polish village, not far from Warsaw. And then I'll read a single scene, which is a depiction of Nadia. She takes part in a film shoot in that square that's on the screen as a musician, and she's set up for it by a woman called Charlie. So here she starts off from Vancouver. Nadia thinks of the ruins back home in Vancouver. She holds them in her mind's eye as her plane crosses the Atlantic. Hotel Balmoral with its blind clock. The Hotel Empress, its windows frosted with tinfoil. The Regent Hotel, once among the street's more substantial buildings. 100 years before the Fishermen's Union ran its business out of the Regent, the Hazelwood Hotel. Woe to the sad Hazelwood with its stained brick front and haphazardly repaired doors. Nadia gazes at an unfamiliar ruin, Warsaw's lovely old town, which was purposefully reconstructed in the 1950s. She knows nothing about European architecture, so she cannot appreciate which era each stuccoed villa is meant to imitate. Her guidebook makes it clear. Everything here was turned to rubble by the Germans during the Warsaw Uprising. So here she's arrived at the village, and this is the heart of the matter for this reading. We have one scene to do with you, Charlie explains. It takes place in a nearby meadow with no one in sight but you. The rest of what we need you for takes place in the studio tomorrow. Is that okay? Nadia nods. For what they're paying her, this is entirely okay. Great, Charlie nudges her toward the others. We have a short walk. It's easier than roaring up in a vehicle. They take a dirt road through what looks like a farmer's back property. The village falls away behind them as the flat land, the church spire, and a low brick building become the only things in view. They cross fields and a meadow. Soft humps and gullies are marked by fence posts hewn from tree boughs. In the distance, a scattering of trees. Behind these, an escarpment that is a rough blue shoulder. Here, Charlie motions at a coat rack where a black jacket and a pair of pants hang. There's a belt too if they're too big over here. Charlie leads her to what looks like an oversized outhouse, but turns out to be a makeshift changing room. Nadia pulls the door shut behind her. It's hot and dry inside like a sauna. She takes off her boots and pants and puts on the black clothes. The belt is looped into the costume pants. It's long enough and narrow enough for her to tie in a knot, so she does. She sits on a tiny stool in the corner to tie up her boots. A pair of shoes sits along the wall for her to try, but this idea repels her. Her boots match the rest of what's been left out. Tramp stuff. On a hook on the back of the door hangs a dark felt fedora with a shiny copper-colored band and a little blue feather. She tucks her hair inside its crown and pulls the hat low over her brow. Who, she wonders, is she dressed as now? Estragon from Waiting for Godot? A Polish circus clown? She takes the dulcimer from its case and steps out into the midday sun. Okay. Charlie points to a chair that sits on a rise in the meadow some 20 meters off. You sit there, we'll film from the back, and with that, she points at a raised platform, from above as well. The chair is mic'd. In Warsaw, we'll have you play the same piece in case we need a fill. What is this field? Nadia wonders aloud as the camera people jostle with their equipment. Charlie glances at her a little shyly. We needed, something unpeopled, with a good view into the distance. She waves at the trees, the escarpment, the cloudless sky. They walk toward the chair. Nadia settles herself on it. We need you, Charlie says, to sit still when you play. Nadia puts her boots firmly on the grass and gets her instrument in place, mid-thigh, to feel the right looseness. She gives the strings a strum. Charlie hovers nearby and then is gone. Gazing into the distance, Nadia wonders if she will ever again play music in so strange a setting. So, Charlie is back. Are you ready? Nadia nods. Her song is called Rumänische Fantasien. Of the recording she sent as possibilities, it's the one that fit the filmmaker's idea of a Jewish-Polish song, or a Polish-Jewish song, depending on who she corresponded with. Charlie had written to say the director thought Nadia played like an old Polish bluesman. Burn this after reading, she wrote. Can you believe he said that? Charlie lays a light hand on Nadia's shoulder and speaks quietly. When I've backed away, count 50, then play. You won't be aware of us at all. The camera guy will be able to shift his depth of field, so we'll bring you in close, okay? Nadia nods. Once Charlie is out of view, she counts from 50 to 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, slowing herself at 4, 3, 2, 1, and into the slow repetition of the song's first chords. A bird calls, and she takes this as her cue to shift into the quicker pace at the center of the song, a whirl of rhythm, 4 times as fast as the rest, which might have once given dancers at a wedding what they needed to propel the bride up on a rickety chair, like the one she sits on. Ecstatic music. Then back to the slow, stately march in order for the song to close in on itself and return to where it started. It's a song that could go on forever, in and out of its fast and slow sections. Nadia listens to the way the dulcimer sounds in the meadow, and she nears the song's final movement. A crazy thing happens. In the near distance, by a line of fence posts, a figure appears, bent over at first, then upright, carrying something under her arm. The figure comes closer, and Nadia sees that it is a woman, old and stout. She carries a basket under one arm. Her hair is white against the greens and browns of the countryside. The woman stops to listen. This is a distraction, but Nadia winds the song up without a hitch. She sits still, hands on her dulcimer strings. The crew begins to grumble and call in Polish. That was great. Charlie rushes by, heading toward the women on the field. Nadia watches as they talk. Then the old woman walks off toward town. Charlie makes her way back. That was beautiful. The crew loved it. That, she points at the old woman heading down the road, we didn't expect, but we're going with it. A little local flavor.
Lovely. Thank you, Norm. I read that book and loved it. And it's something so wonderful about hearing an author read in his or her own.
Thanks, my
So,
pleasure.
Norm, this is a panel that we've convened on the broad theme of Canadian Jewish historical fiction. So I wanted to start with the question to you about how your writing, your literary writing, engages with history or Canadian history, with Jewish history. You know, writers have to deal with some kind of encounter with history and imagination when writing historical fiction. And I just wondered if you have, or what your sense of you know, a writer's obligation is to history, and
Right.
what the nature of that, what it looks like.
So the way to answer that with the best relevance to this novel is to say that for about 20 years, or up until the point at which I started working on this, so not so long as that, I wanted to do something in relation to Poland that was substantial. I'd done short things and non-fictional things, and fiction in a very kind of limited way. But the goal to do something related to Polish Jewish history just wouldn't resolve. So it took a very long time to find a way to do it and an avenue into it. And I think I was just patient with that, and I didn't have any strong sense of how I would or should. And then the thing that motivated me to keep thinking was visits to Poland. So that's maybe an unusual way to go about pursuing history. But the idea was read about these things and, of course, study pre-war Poland, and then, as I do, teach things related to the Holocaust. But my feeling about writing fiction about pre-war and wartime and post-war Poland didn't seem justified until many, many visits and many false tries, I would say. So that's in some way not exactly what you're looking for, but the challenge was one that took a very long time to resolve, and I think I set aside maybe 4 big drafts that were meant to be Polish books, Polish Jewish books, before this version arrived. So I was patient. I waited on it for a long time.
Yeah, I wonder the kind of broad pitch to you as well about how your writing as a, you know, literary endeavor engages with history, and what you think the enterprise is all about.
I've been thinking about that a lot. But first of all, thank you for having me. And it's great to see so many people attending. And thank you, Norman, for your reading. Yeah, so I research a lot to the point that sometimes I worry that the research can kind of stunt the writing. So I try not to do that before, but do it at the same time, even if it means that while I'm writing, I may hit some points where I don't know if what I'm doing is correct, and I'm just going to mark it and keep going, because I just don't want to be that person who researches endlessly, because it's endless, and I enjoy it. You know what I mean? But I don't want it to take away from the writing, which for me is, trumps everything. Now, as far as the responsibility thing, which I think we were talking about before, like, I struggle with that, on one hand, I feel like there's an advantage to writing something that is based on historical, on fact and on a historical timeline, because it gives you a little bit of a shape. It gives you something to work with, and I appreciate that. But it also comes with some pressure, to force your work into some sort of a shape that does not always, it's not as flexible, I would say. So yeah, it's something I keep struggling with, you know what I mean? Like, how much do I have to follow what I know is fact? And I tend to think that, like I'll give you an example why I'm feeling like I can't really speak about it without examples. So right now I'm writing a novel that is based on a historical era in Israel. And I really want my characters to be arrested at a certain protest. And as much as I've looked it up, I can't find evidence that anyone was arrested in said protest. I also didn't find any evidence that, that nobody was arrested at that protest. That's enough for me to work with that. So yeah, it's kind of, it's a bit of a balancing act, I find. Yeah, I take liberties, but I do appreciate the anchors that the historical research allows me. Yeah.
Sarah, you want to jump in, or I mean, hopefully, the aim is for people to jump in when they're ready, if they want to tag on to questions, and otherwise, you can Sarah can take over if you.
Yeah, so here's what I'm wondering, as I was listening to both Ayelet and Norm, if we turn it upside down and ask it maybe in a different way. Ayelet, you were talking directly, and Norm, you gestured towards the way in which we might have an obligation to history. There's research done, there are things that happened in the past. So what I guess what I want to know is, in choosing to write fiction as opposed to, I don't know, a historical narrative, what does that bring to the past? In other words, what is layering a fiction onto a remembered past do that perhaps historiography doesn't do?
Well, for me, I'll jump. For me, it was a project of matching Canada and Poland. So a fictional strategy is open to that kind of a game. And then it operates a little bit like a movie would, in that you can cut back and forth. And that in both settings, the substrata of the local history is key, but then what's happening on the ground is contemporary. And the fictional frame lets all of that stuff sort of flow and accelerate and contrast, where if you're not working in that in fiction, you're going to have a lot more trouble engaging with all of that different possibility.
Well, I can also answer that. I can say that I'm a writer. I'm not a historian. So I don't know what else to do, and when something interests me, as the past does. And I think maybe I may go on a limb and say that, Jewish literature sometimes, our past kind of haunts our present. I don't know what else to do with that. The only thing I can do is write fiction. Like I'll never write a history book because it's not what I do. That's just the way I engage with my past and with our collective past. Yeah.
So I think this idea of engaging with the collective past is in a way very germane to what we're looking at, even in calling a panel Canadian Jewish historical fiction. There are so many collectives invoked by how we've sort of named the title. And I think you, Ayala, and all of you really fit in some ways, and could also fit yourself into other kinds of very broad rubrics. So if we're talking about the way one engages, let's say, the Jewish past and the Jewish collective, maybe that's even a broader question. To what extent do you think writers do engage a collective, some kind of collective sensibility, whether it's of a people, of a country, of a nation? And to what extent does a writer simply engage the inner life of the writer?
I don't know that they're separable. At least they wouldn't be for me. In this novel, Evening, the one that was just published, I don't have a history that I'm investigating, although I did try not to make mistakes. The actual story shuttles between the past and the present, and I was very aware of the research of memory that shows that every time we take a memory out and tell it, we subtly alter it. And when we put it back in the drawer and take it out again, it isn't the same. I've never had a factual memory, so that was my reason for writing fiction. I knew I would not be a historian, but I do have an emotional memory. I have a very powerful memory of what it felt like to do or feel certain things. And I think in this book, all kinds of tidbits and tendrils entered the book. It's not an autobiographical novel, but bits of history that I'd heard from all kinds of people and places, what a tin of salmon cost at the turn of the 20th century, or whether pregnant women walked at night in Toronto well before the Second World War. Narratives that entered my mind that I had never consciously used artistically, those all came in. And it happens that my heroine is also obsessed with the past, the British literary past between the wars, and she describes a kind of perfume of the past that haunts her, whereas her sister, whom she's mourning, has no use for the past and has no use for what she sees as her sister's immersion in memory and emotion, rather than just getting on with it. So the past is actually a subject of the book as well.
David's turn.
I mean, what do we mean when we talk about the past? Like, what is the past? I don't really write about the deep past. And in terms of a community, and of Jewish literature, I think I write about a marginal Jewish community, even within the larger community, which is Soviet Jews. So to the extent that that participates in the larger community, that's a good question. I think people try to identify with the history of Soviet Jews, but most of the Jews in Canada came before the Soviet Jews arrived. I think they had an imperfect understanding of what Soviet Jews were. By the time Soviet Jews came here, which was basically the late 70s and early 80s, I think they felt quite foreign even from the Jews who were here. So a lot of my work has been just writing about this marginal community of Jews, which is fairly significant numerically, and also fairly significant culturally. But as far as history goes, I mean, I've written about Canada in the 80s and 90s. It didn't seem like history when I started writing. It's like the present, but it's 30 years ago, 20 years ago,
Yeah.
40 years ago. right? So, what do we mean by history? What's our understanding of it? And if it's lived experience and that you've lived it, to what extent is that history or not? I mean, I'm not that old. At least I don't like to think of myself as being that old. So when I write about my own experience, I don't feel like it's historical. When I look at it, on the great calendar, yeah, it's now sliding back into history. I think the other thing I'd say is the history that interests me, and maybe because of Soviet Jews, is an unknowable history, which is why I probably couldn't write nonfiction, because so much of it has been destroyed, disappeared, unspoken about for all these various reasons. And that's why I'm interested in fiction. I know some of it, and then I can kind of project some sense of narrative or my own sensibility into it, and try to create the closest I can to an approximation of what that would have been like, even though recognizing that some of it is completely unknowable.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're going to actually follow up on what a few of you talked about, which is this sense of how a writer's lived experience moves through a work of fiction. But before that, I'd like to invite Nessa to read a passage for us from Evening. So Nessa.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. It's fun to be in a conversation geographically distant like this, and to be sort of back in my birthplace, but sort of not. I'm going to read from the opening of the novel only because the first chapter of this book really took me by surprise. It had an actual story that I wasn't expecting. So I can't read from any other section because all these pieces of the story unfold and I can't give it a context. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. I think what the listeners need to know is that there are two, the narrator and heroine's name is Eve, and there are two events that are conditioning the fact that she's about to grieve for at the night before and then the funeral of her sister in the Shiva, which is the structure of the book. One is that she and her sister had a huge fight 2 weeks before her sister died, and they didn't resolve it, which was against all their family codes, but which haunts her. And the other that she doesn't know, but I did know, is that right after the funeral, she's about to find out a secret. And there are several secrets in the book. She's about to find out a secret that upends her whole view of her sister, herself, her family. So here she is at the very beginning. One loves, the other is loved, so Nana taught us. I look at the beautiful bones of her face and speculate about this pronouncement. My grandmother has always been beloved, and so my grandfather, long dead, assumes a peculiar poignancy. Once, in some rapturous, unimaginable youth before she married, Nana was the ardent lover. But no one is alive to tell us about the object of her affection, and she will not disclose his name. We are sitting in the living room of my mother's house, waiting for the funeral to begin. Outside, the sky is the eerie pewter I remember from my childhood, lightless even at midday. In this room 6 years ago, before our mother recovered the furniture yet again, Tam and I were laughing at the weather. Then too, it was noon when I realized after her baby's naming ceremony was over and the last guests had straggled out, that the day would not improve, that, to quote Tam, this is it. I had fled to New York, whose winters are tamed by the city's determination to outwit the season. Tam not only stayed in Toronto, betraying our pact to leave the minute we could, but chose a profession that forced her to rise most mornings at 4 in order to be on the air. For her, the half year of darkness is permanent, I think to myself, and then think, permanent darkness. Paralyzed, I stare at Nana, imploring her to rescue me, but she is stoic, not emitting whatever feelings she no doubt has. The fact is, my sister, her eldest grandchild, is dead. The silence in this room is not the anticipatory hush preceding a family celebration, but the void of what cannot be accommodated. Tam, In speaking my sister's name, I have invaded Nana's solitude. I look at her carefully and observe, even in the somber room, that the skin beneath her eyes is gleaming. No one has seen my grandmother cry. Lawrence is coming, I state, more bluntly than intended. Nana's lips draw into a pucker of distaste. Once again, Eve has said the wrong thing. Why doesn't my admiration of my grandmother offset her reservations about me?
Thank you, Nessa. Thank you so much. Lovely reading. And it really leads me into something I'd like all of you to explore, but I'll start with you, Nessa. You, like Eve, like the character, was born in Toronto and moved to the cultural excitement of New York City and made a home there. And like Eve, you have sisters and a mother who lives in Toronto. And yet, of course, this is a work of fiction. So I wonder if you would be willing to talk a little bit about how, really following up on the last conversation, how does the stamp of your own lived experience imprints on the book? How do you, and clearly you do, at least to some extent, integrate autobiographical material? Do you identify with one character, with several characters, or something totally different?
I think each book is probably different. I will say, as I indicated before, this book in its nature took me by surprise completely. And I used to read about writers who would say things like, well, my characters decided to do X. And I thought, really? But this chapter, this first chapter, came to me in an instant. And I was very excited because I was sure this would be my easy book, because I don't find writing hard, but I find getting to writing extremely hard. I'm an excellent procrastinator, and I'm a very good avoider of writing. So this just happened, and there it was, a setup, a story with a secret and these sisters and a plot. And I thought, oh, this is going to be great, because I had spent 10 years writing this very audacious avant-garde Jewish fiction that has been published only in part. And I thought, okay, this is going to be easy. It's been 30 years from the moment I started that chapter. I am as abashed and humbled by this as anybody. And when people say to me, well, why did it take so long? I can't explain it. It just took that long. I wrote 2 other books in between. They weren't fiction, the ones you mentioned. I knew I was obsessed with these sisters. They didn't change that much. It isn't that I transformed them. I changed. And I went from being a woman in my later 30s to being a middle-aged person. And I think the wisdom I accrued along the way and the humility of understanding how unblack and white I was and how uncertain everything seemed compared to the adamants of my youth helped me make the book I needed to make. And the only thing I can say about it is, when I was finished, I knew I was finished. There were many people who thought I would never let it go. I knew I would finish it. I'm a maniacal perfectionist about my writing, but I do finish everything or quit, but I don't just linger. This is the time it took to get all the pieces in place. And although I made many outlines and I tried to be a different kind of writer, really in the end, the structure just came to me. You mentioned my beloved mentor, Ted Solotaroff, who's no longer alive. I took him out to coffee shortly after I started this. And I said to him, I'm struggling with this plot. How do I tell this story? And he looked at me and he said, plot is character. When you know your characters, you'll know. And I think that's what happened, but I think I couldn't know these complicated sisters with their devotion and their competition and the intricacy of their relationships until I'd lived more.
Thank you. And it seems to me that in your memoir, as well as in A Woman's Book of Grieving, the theme of loss and the passage of time is very important, and that seems to carry over into this novel as well. So those seems to be things that you are always negotiating about one's relationship to the past.
I think that's very true. And this links, as you said, back to the previous conversation we were having, because for me, I like to say I come on one side from an eminent rabbinic family with a lot of commentators whose names are known in the circles where people seriously study interpretations. And I say they wouldn't recognize me, but I recognize them. I do feel in enormous continuity with the Jewish past in all its variations. And the more I look at facets I didn't know, the more exhilarated I get. I'm in love with the music of the poetry of Piyut. I discover my own Sephardi roots way, way back before the expulsion. I feel I'm in this huge conversation between the growing past and the way we live now, to use an expression. And I used to joke I was writing the Great American Sentence, because until I figured out that Jewishness was really the heart of where I was, I don't think I had much to say. But the past haunts me. I came of age right after the Shoah. It was, as I like to say, it was the years where there was no pedagogy about introducing children to the Shoah. So we saw all those documentaries by the time we were 10 years old. And Tisha B'Av at Camp Ramah was full of, narratives of the Holocaust. And although I pledged my entire non-writing life to making a vibrant, generationally appropriate Jewishness that we could all live with and reinforce, this book has a lot of Shoah in it. I wouldn't have expected it. So I'm not saying I was helpless, but I'm saying my outlines were of no use. And once I let my imagination travel back and forth between the present of her life and the past, that's when things really started to flow.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering, David, if I can engage you in the same kind of question, because after all, the title story of Immigrant City has a main character, a protagonist, who is himself an immigrant and has a young family and lives in Toronto. And one can't help thinking that there are at least superficial connections to you, and some of at least the family names and the backgrounds of people flow from that book to your earlier collection of short stories. So I'll ask you the same question. How do you imprint your lived experience in your characters? To what extent does autobiography reach into it and not?
It reaches into it to the extent that it's important and useful to the fiction. It's a game I've been playing, I guess, for my entire career, where I've written mostly, The Betrayers, the novel, departs from that. But other than that, I've been playing a game using my own and my family's biographical information and making fiction out of it. So most of what happens in the stories never happened, but the context I draw from life. And it is a game where you invite the reader to believe something about yourself that isn't true, and to do it convincingly. And there's some satisfaction in playing that sort of game. But there's a purpose to it. The reason that I do it is because in order for me to write, I need to be deeply emotionally connected to the material. And I've just found that, my community, my family has provided me with a lot of rich material that I'm able to connect to. And then mine, or I don't like to use the word exploit because I don't feel that's what I'm doing, but find a way to tap into an emotion and then through the story, convey it to the reader.
Yeah, thank you. Ayala, Norm, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, it is tricky terrain, and it's interesting because everyone answers in different ways. And it's as if the usefulness or the character of autobiography for each writer is probably on different terrain, although certain things that David says are familiar and certain things that Nessa says are familiar. In my case, too, there are family kernels, but I don't know if we call that autobiographical in the sense that it's not stuff that happened to me, but rather it's something that someone told so remarkably well, and their experience was so unlike anything that I could have experienced that I, whether conscious or unconsciously, held on to it till it could be used. And then you run out of those. So I'm sort of getting near the end of them, actually. So do we call that autobiography? Not quite. It's a bit like what David's saying. It's ancestral, it's family, it's context, and yet you kind of set it there and wait for it to take shape, to be able to use it.
Yes, and I like that David used the word game, and to me, it's also a little bit of a tease. It invites people who don't know you except through your fiction to think they know something, maybe even intimate about you, but in a way they kind of don't. Although in a way, in the sense that fiction does create a certain kind of intimate knowledge, although maybe not a factual intimate knowledge, it does. So, I think that's really interesting. Ayelet, any thoughts on that?
I feel like, I don't know if I have much to add about that. I love the imagining part, but I use scenarios from my own life or from stories that, I've heard in my family or in my community. And then I kind of let it take flight. So often that's, especially with short stories, I would say that's often how it starts. I start with a scenario that is very much taken, from something in my youth or from my own life, and then, what happens in the story. So the themes are obviously autobiographical, but also there's a lot of, situations or moments that are from my own life or from, family life. But then I let it just take flight. I let it explode. And I love that.
So, and is there a difference between the way you write in your collection of short stories and your memoirs?
It's funny, people often say that it's very different. To me, I'm in the business of telling stories, so it's not that different. It comes with certain constraints. They both do. The short story comes with constraints. A novel has constraints. Writing historical fiction, if that's what we call it, from the 90s, apparently is historical fiction now. That has its own constraint, and the memoir form has constraints, and you work within them. But even in memoir, I think that's important, because you were saying how people get this illusion that they know you. I think the memoir does that too, in a sense, because it is a conceit in a sense, because you're curating moments to create a narrative. You know what I mean? Like, it's not everything you've gone through, it's not everything you experienced. You choose what to reveal to create a certain story, and there's a persona that also, it's not everything that you are, but the parts that make sense within that narrative. There's a character. So it to me, it's a very similar process, and I enjoy them both. Right now, I'm sick of me, and I'm like really happy to be writing fiction again. But it's about story. It's about stories.
So, being about stories, could I invite you to read a passage?
Sure. Yeah.
As
So I'm gonna.
you prepare, let me also just remind all of the participants who are not on the panel that you can put your questions in the Q&A. You don't have to wait till the panel's done. We'll do our best when we get to it to curate them, but they don't need to come in a flurry at the end. So feel free to write in some questions.
Okay. So I'm gonna read from a story that's titled "The Poets in the Kitchen Window." Like David, I write about a very small community within the Jewish community, and that's what I'm interested in. And I'm just going to read from the beginning of the story. The missile started falling on Tel Aviv on the night of January 17th, a few hours after Operation Desert Storm began in Iraq. They had been prepared, carrying their gas masks with them everywhere for weeks. Cardboard boxes with dangling straps like purses, which some girls in Uri's class had decked out with stickers and collages. At school, they had run drills with everyone sitting in a row on the floor, leaning against the wall, elbowing each other and giggling. None of them had ever sat in shelters, had ever even heard a siren. The only war in their lifetime had been the Lebanon War, which erupted in 1982 when Uri was 4 and had never really ended. From images he saw on the news, Uri knew that people up north had sat in shelters, New soldiers had died, even a classmate's brother. But in Ramat Gan, the suburban town where he lived, hours away from the border, it was sometimes easy to forget. When the first siren sounded, Uri thought it was a part of a dream. He had been dreaming about wars a lot lately. Dreams where he was taller and braver and Ashkenazi. His skin lighter, his eyes blue, like one of those black and white pictures of soldiers he had seen in history books, tears glistening in their eyes after they had liberated Jerusalem. As Uri watched the sepia movies his teacher had screened in history class, the stiff, clownish, fast-moving soldiers waving from tanks and marching in the streets, he wished he had been born earlier, back before independence, when the pioneers had built kibbutzim and paved roads and rebelled against the British, when soldiers cried at the Wailing Wall, and there was a purpose, a greater meaning, a larger battle. It seemed like everything of significance had happened before he was born. In his last year of elementary school, he had written a poem about it, titled Other Wars, which had won his school poetry contest, earning him publication in the school paper and a month of mockery from the boys in his grade, who recited parts of it with a lisp and constituted the word fag every time war appeared in the poem. That first night, Uri sat on his parents' bed with his dad, their gas masks pressing red marks around their faces. Uri had fastened the straps so tight that his chin ached. They had sealed the room a few days earlier, covering the windows with heavy-duty plastic sheeting and duct tape like the IDF had instructed on TV. The mask smelled of rubber, like a new toy, and Uri could hear his breathing as though he were underwater. Then the first missile hit, and Uri's heart lurched in his chest like a jerked knee. His father, looking like a frightened giant ant, wrapped his arm around him and pulled him closer. 5 or 6 more explosions echoed in the distance, sounding like fireworks on Independence Day or a fighter jet that had broken the sound barrier. And then one more, closer this time. The 7th floor apartment walls shuddered with the reverberation. Uri's body was tense, his jaw clenched, but it was the kind of fear that put things into proportion, making every other fear he'd ever felt, of failing a test in school, of jumping headfirst into the swimming pool, of embarrassing himself in front of Avital Ginsburg, back when he used to like her, which he no longer did, seemed trivial. It was the kind of fear that made him stronger, a man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayel, for plunging us into your story. So I'm actually going to begin with you now and ask you this. In your stories, you have characters who are in Israel, you have characters who are in the west coast of Canada, in Toronto, in Thailand. And so I'm wondering about home. What does home mean in your writing? Is home important? How do characters find home?
There's so much to say, and none of it is really going to be wise. I think I want to say that as an immigrant, I'm really interested in place, and I think immigrants generally are. We're kind of like, we look at places differently, and their sort of literary qualities reveal themselves to us, I think. So I'm writing a lot about place and about home, but I feel like maybe it's something that it's a preoccupation that came before that, and it partially because I'm from Israel. And it's a place that is very contested, as we all know. It's the understatement of the century. And also with borders that are kind of shifting constantly. There's a sense of home that I think is very fractured in Israel, and we hold on to it very tightly because of that. So I think maybe it comes from there, and then, you know, there's losing a father at a young age, which is another fractured sense of home. So all of this is everywhere, and it's, you know, constantly reappearing in my work. My favorite answer about home is the page. I've said that before, and I wrote it in my book, so it feels a bit trite now, but it feels like the one place where that is steady in its comfort.
Yes. And I know that's true of your page, the page that you're writing, but do other people's pages help you find home? That is, other people's writing.
Yeah, I would say that it's interesting because as a younger person who read everything in sight, I found I found home in books, but in a sense, I feel like I was a little bit of a foster child in there because I didn't find it, I wasn't actually in there. My community, people who looked like me, people whose grandparents spoke, or parents spoke Arabic, were not present in these books that I loved and cherished as a child. But, you know, that's something, I think that understanding is something that came to me later and was a part of my impetus, part of the reason that I wanted to write these kind of characters in my own work, to sort of rectify that experience.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. And Nessa, you know, when in part of our correspondence, you made a kind of offhand remark about something, you know, being you're Canadian, so you did something according to the rules, and we you know, emailed a little bit about what habits we acquire that to us connote I'm American, I'm Canadian, I'm Israeli, I'm something. So what about you, Nessa? What's home in your writing?
Listening to all of you, I think there's a dimension that we haven't talked about that links for me home and the past, which is that I would say writing for me is an act of retrieval and restoration, that I have an ache about everything that's forgotten and everyone who's lost. And of course, I can't write that, RIGHT, but I long to bring what was hidden and forgotten into light. And it animates me. And I have a great tenderness for the Jewish past, both its wonders and its exceptionalism, which I do subscribe to, but also its tragedies, both. And in some ways, you talked about Canada, in some ways, the two narratives I inherited reflect both of those stories. Because my grandmother, whom you knew, was born in Canada, which was very unusual for Canadian Jewry, and was an observant Jew and an astonishingly accomplished, exceptional person. I had a kind of sunny, I describe it as that side of my family, and I say in my memoir, they had a patrician pity for anyone who didn't believe that you could be an observant Jew and do absolutely anything. And my mother, but both my parents supported, but my mother's gave us all the gift of Jewish literacy and access to Hebrew, which is just so indispensable, and which of course gave me a passport to Israel in a very different way. My father was first generation Canadian, much more inflected by the Shoah, a kind of lost luster from this rabbinic past that he knew about, but he was an eminent doctor, but he used to say to us, I'm the first generation in which there were no Rappaport rabbis. We were 4 daughters, no sons in the 50s. We knew we couldn't become rabbis. We knew we couldn't pass on the kahuna, the priestliness that he was born into. So I would say for me, those two beacons animated my work. One, an attempt to retrieve what was gone, and one truly an attempt to celebrate this remarkable people that I feel a part of, this exceptional identity that matters to me. I certainly think I can't make any comments about Canada now except admiration, but in the Toronto I grew up in, I felt I came from something very profound and deep, but that Canadian culture didn't really recognize it. And I was in a bit of an exchange with Norm and said why A.M. Klein mattered to me so much, because he took his profound Jewish literacy and tried to make art out of it at a time when Canadian Jewish writers just weren't doing that. So there's a bit of a restoration, a retrieval. And my daughter's a journalist. She interviewed me and she said, "Why do you keep going back to Canada in your work?" And I can't really explain it, but it shaped me. And similarly, the 90s, when people say, well, what is it about the 90s? Most of it's, what is it about the 90s is I started the book in the 90s and I was wedded to the present tense of the book, which, as you all say, soon became a historical narrative. It wasn't supposed to be.
I'm hoping we can emphasize the Canada here a little bit more as well. It strikes me that there's so much more concrete that can be drawn upon from Jewish history, and Canada, both like as place and as idea, is a little more underdetermined. So I'm wondering if any of the other panelists might have some thoughts about the kind of Canadian in the Canadian Jewish fiction, and maybe other Canadian writers that you read that really you think might capture something about what it means to write about or as a Canadian, or if you have your own reflections on this theme.
Well, I come from a fairly undetermined Canadian city, Calgary. And in that sense, my way of placing myself in relationship to what we know and say about Jewish history and Jewish literature is kind of idiosyncratic. And I think overall the West, at least west of Winnipeg, remains to some degree undetermined, although there's a lot of terrific stuff that's been done. So I have felt over the years that I sort of had some gold there, that Calgary, but then in this book, Vancouver, certainly their Jewishness was fresh still. And the differences between what we read in more familiar writing about these things and how one can present them in relation to cities like Vancouver. And the joke is that often when you say you're going to do this, you get a kind of a blank look because the appreciation simply isn't, it's not there. The idea that kind of storytelling is going to work. So Nessa's comments about things hidden really very much for me work in relation to Canada, but you got to go to the places that haven't been overworked yet. So in my case, 60s Vancouver, the very late stages of what was a Jewish business district on what is now called the downtown East Side became sort of a very rich vein for me. The risk is that people don't know about it, so it doesn't seem to exist in their minds. But then the opportunity is to try to open it up. And this book takes Canada from that direction. Those particular streets in Vancouver that you've probably only heard of because you know of the troubles there, but we can do it in different terms if we want to from a Jewish perspective.
I'd say, I mean, I was a reader more before than now, but of North American Jewish fiction. And in terms of Canadians, Leonard Cohen to some extent, Mordecai Richler to a significant extent, and reading those writers who were writing about Jewish communities of the 60s, really the 50s and 60s, and recognizing that there was some dramatic potential in the community that I was living in, which is Toronto, in a remote part of Toronto, nondescript part of Toronto, Northwest Toronto, Bathurst and Steeles. But there was a story there that to me felt as interesting and dramatic and legitimate as the things that I've been reading about by these other writers. And I guess there's some sense of, I don't know, even audacity that I was going to write about this place unequivocally, and try to do for this little, corner of Toronto what some of these other writers had done for theirs. And, to the extent that I was successful, some of the stories ran in the New Yorker. I remember when a story ran in the New Yorker, and the first lines of that are, Goldfinch was flapping clotheslines, a tenement delirious with striving. Deborah Treisman, the editor, there's like, what's Goldfinch? Like, you should explain it. And I'm like, just go with it, and then I named, a particular address on Bathurst Street and a name of a street on Cedarcroft. And to see that, in print prominently, it was like, it was an act of subversion or audacity or gall and provocation. That was important to me. I wanted to, unequivocally write about this place that I was from without embarrassment, and to see if it could stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the things that I'd read.
You brought back a memory. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say you brought back a memory I'd forgotten, speaking of memory, which is that although my first novel was published in New York by William Morrow, major mainstream, I should say, company, I insisted that it be in Canadian spelling. I don't even know why I did that.
Really?
I had two insistences. One was that the Hebrew not be italicized, because this really was my Jewish book and I wanted Hebrew to be synthesized with everything else. And the second was that it be in Canadian spelling. And to his credit, my wonderful editor indulged me. And I can't explain it because I knew the minute I came to New York that was the city I was meant to live in. But it must have been really part of my identity for me to insist on that. All those U's are in there. O-U-R,
Wow.
O-U-S. Yeah.
David, will you read a passage for us?
Sure. So this is a story called Little Rooster. I'm going to come into it kind of in the middle, so I'll set it up. It's from Immigrant City. And I guess since we're talking about historical fiction, Canadian fiction, this is really the story that deals most with history. I'm not going to start at the beginning, so all you need to know is that a narrator named David, my age, blah, 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 inherits a bin with his grandfather's documents. In that bin are a number of letters written in Yiddish, which he cannot read. So he goes to a friend of his, an acquaintance who teaches at a rival university to York, and is a Yiddishist. And that professor says she can't do it, but she recommends a grad student, a Norwegian grad student I'd encountered in my time, surprised to find who was actually studying Yiddish. These are not all Jews. And so there's this Norwegian grad student who agrees that he's going to, for a fee, translate these letters for this narrator who can't read the Yiddish himself. So I'll kind of pop in the middle. So Knut is the Norwegian. He didn't pretend to understand the implications of everything he'd read, but he believed the letters touched upon matters of a delicate nature. It was possible, of course, that what he'd read in the letters was already common knowledge to me and my family, and perhaps even if it wasn't, I might not be disturbed by what he'd uncovered. People had different sensitivities. However, from the tone and content of the letters, Knut suspected that they addressed something confidential between my grandfather and his brother. Though I was tempted, I took Knut's advice and resolved to reflect. One of life's cruelest lessons is that a person can't unknow something. And there exists enough unavoidable pain in the world that one would be a fool or a masochist to actively court more. My grandfather, whom I loved very much, and whose essence was still sometimes palpable to me, was dead 10 years. His brother, a man I didn't recall ever meeting, was dead 17. What did I stand to gain by scavenging through the past? The reflexive answer, of course, was that sacrament, the truth. After all, it was just a cruel stroke of history perpetrated by the dread mustached visages that explained why I couldn't read the letters myself. And would my grandfather have kept them? like so many Israeli bus passes, if he didn't want them to be found. Perhaps the sin wasn't of trespass, but of laziness and indifference. How many vain and useless things had I done while these letters languished, humming with meaning? And wasn't there a privileged kind of knowing available to us only after our loved ones had gone? In other words, I walked around the block and justified doing what I already wanted to do. Summary of letter from Benjamin Singer to Burl Singer. Burl is the grandfather. Benjamin is his brother, Venya. 6 March 1999. Benjamin asks after Burl's well-being. He repeats his condolences on the death, January 1999, of Burl's wife, Shana, a generous heart loved by all, but reminds Burl that the living must live. He asks if Burl has returned to the Latvian Cultural Center and if he has been able to verify that the woman he saw there was Lauma. He admonishes Burl not to let the matter drop. He concludes with affectionate wishes. Summary of letter from Benjamin Singer to Burl Singer, 30 March 1999. Benjamin praises Burl for persisting R.E. Lauma. He remarks upon the mysteries of fate. He dismisses Burl's reservations and apprehensions. There is an uncontextualized allusion to homemade farmer's cheese, ? He insists Burl act decisively and make contact with Lauma. He concludes with affectionate wishes. Summary of letter from Benjamin Singer to Burl Singer, 9 May 1999. Benjamin congratulates Burl on Victory Day, Great Patriotic War. He reproaches Burl for the pessimistic attitude he displayed during their telephone conversation, date unspecified. He says that he has slept poorly since the conversation, worried about Burl. He relates his attempts to book a flight to Toronto. He cites his course of chemotherapy and his doctor's refusal to write a letter of permission to airline. He criticizes his doctor, the Israeli healthcare system, and the airline. He insists he feels well, but is not naive about his prospects. This explains his sense of urgency, R.E. Lauma. He says she's the love of his life. He concludes with affectionate wishes. Summary of letter from Benjamin Singer to Burl Singer, 3 July 1999. NB, handwriting illegible in some places. Benjamin asks after Burl's well-being. He apologizes for his long silence. He experienced complications from the surgery. He blames a commander, ? For the ? Pills. Electricity ? And his hand makes it hard for him to write. He confirms that he received Burl's last letter. He says the sisters ? Stole the photograph Burl sent of Lauma. He asks that Burl send another. He encloses a photograph of himself taken in the ? Fortress. He also encloses a letter to Lauma. He asks Burl to relay it. He recalls a different letter. He asks Burl to deliver to her. He hopes Burl has ? Vagina ? This time ? He concludes with affectionate wishes.
It's a great passage, David. There's something that's something devastating about the inaccessibility of this past, of an immigrant past, and sometimes in this case, and actually, I'm thinking about the broad preoccupation in the kind of classic golden age of North American Jewish writing that seems to me so much about the immigrant experience, and sort of struggles with its inaccessibility. I'm wondering what energizes your writing, and whether you think the immigration is kind of at the heart of what's exciting about Jewish writing now, and can it continue to be? If not, what might replace it? Wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't know. I've thought about that, written about it a little bit. I think immigration, and Irving Howe wrote about it too. Immigration, can serve as a source while it's a living thing. I mean, immigration retrospective is just history. So for me, when I've written about immigrant writing, the immigrant experience, it's been a living experience. And to the extent that it's been interesting to me, I guess I discovered as a young man, when I came to this country, I was 6. And at first, it's pretty typical, wishing to assimilate, looking to be like, for the most part, other Canadian Jews that I knew. I went to Hebrew school and grew up in a community that was predominantly Jewish. I think that's fair to say. But then I realized that the stories that I was hearing in their households weren't nearly as interesting as what I heard in my own household. What my parents and their friends talked about, what my grandparents talked about. And to me, that became very clear that it was something I had access to, that I had a foot in both worlds, that I could serve as a bridge between these two worlds, that I was deeply emotionally connected to it. And so, I wrote about it. With this story, I mean, there's something also about Canada and Toronto that I'll say about this particular story. It's really about Latvians, ethnic Latvians, and Jewish Latvians, and those are the characters in the story. You have the narrator, who's a Latvian Jew, discovers that possibly his grandfather was having an affair, may have had it back in the old country, and reconnected with a woman who is now ethnic Latvian living in Toronto. And between him and her granddaughter, they try to figure out what happened. But by virtue of that, it's digging into all these stereotypes and resentments and hatreds from the Second World War and misunderstandings between Latvians, ethnic Latvians, and Jews. And I think what was interesting to me is I didn't have to set it in Latvia. I could set it in Toronto, that it's possible to do that here. And I think that's the case with a lot of the stories in this collection. There's a story about Somalis in Immigrant City. Well, you don't have to go to Somalia to do it. You can actually do it in Toronto. And I think that's what's valuable and worth defending and protecting about Canadian culture at its best. We're not perfect. We're far from perfect. But if you've been around a little bit and traveled, you can, by comparison, see how much better this place is than a lot of other fucking places.
Good city. I've been mindful that there's, we're running out of time. We're slowly coming upon that time. There's been some great questions that have been coming in the Q&A, some of which I've tried to cover, and Sarah, we've sort of mentioned it. So maybe I'll just see if I can pluck a couple before our last one. One great one was about in writing Jewish literature, if any of you are sort of concerned at all with losing any readership that may not know in advance that they're interested in Jewish culture.
Well, that's no way to write.
That's a direct answer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it might be broadened out to sort of thinking about readership in general. Do you have a reader in mind when you write? Who is that reader, and what does that look like?
For me, that your previous question might help orient that. Maybe a Canadian one comes first, but that might just reflect what your career audience has developed to be. So it wouldn't be any more specific than that. And I think, though, a little less direct than David's answer, I'm sometimes aware that I'm onto something that's a little less Jewish or not very Jewish, and then that might have a certain purpose to it, and also unconsciously an audience that is different. And then you get to something that you've decided you will work on that is more distinct and more particular in its Jewish form. And then you've made a call at some point as to what the flavor will be or what the texture will be. But it's more the work that's defining that than your notion of who your audience would be, I think.
Some of the Q&As that we've been looking at are interested in the Canadian component of the writers of this panel, and they're wondering, first of all, for Norm and David, whether having grown up in Canada shapes what you write, enables you to write a certain kind of fiction, and whether for Nessa, similarly, having grown up in Canada, enters into your fiction, shapes it. And I guess we could kind of turn that a little bit for Ayelet and ask whether, having been in Canada, now you're coming to us from Israel, but your writing is in English, not in your native tongue. So I think people are wondering about the Canadianness of this writing, whether that's something that you think of consciously, or it's just part of who you are, or yeah, some of the questions really revolve around that. And I wonder whether any of you would like to respond to that, this sort of cluster of questions.
I mean, can I just say, like, it's such a Canadian question. It's such like a self-denigrating Canadian question, right? Like, yeah, well, we live here. Why wouldn't we write about it? I mean, you'd have to make a concerted effort to block out part of yourself not to do it. And then you'd have to be doing it for some external market or, self-conscious reasons. So no, but though I do agree with Norm that, yeah, I mean, different subjects call to you, and they don't necessarily all have to be Canadian or Jewish. But the ones that do, by virtue of having lived a life here, not exclusively, but largely, it would be strange for me not to write and have things set in Canada.
I think the phenomenon shows up quite clearly in the early Canadian Jewish writers. So Klein and Wiseman and Henry Kreisel, they're all a little doubtful about Canada as a topic. So those are books that come out in the 50s. And they may allow 10 or 15 or 20 pages, and then the story leaves for a more important part of the world. But there's a neat letter to Henry Kreisel when he's working on his first book. And the editor is actually saying, could we have a little bit more Toronto? So it's as if by that point, so that's the late 40s, that fear or that discomfort or the sense that there will be no proper audience for this was turning. And on the publishing side and on the writer's side, unavailability for that material. So that's a long time ago.
I would just add, I think that's a really good point, Norm, that I think Canadian writers of previous generations left Canada in order to write about other places. Mavis Gallant, Richler lived abroad for a while. You could name quite a few, but a lot of them, like we stay and live here, and so therefore we must believe it's a viable and legitimate place to not just live in but write about.
And I could say that even having been one of the people who left, I remember, I put this is another one of those little tendrils that entered my novel. I come home. Where is home? Home is Toronto. My mother, my sister, my family, I still have a lot of people there. As soon as COVID's over, I'll be back. And I always would go, because it was across the street from my parents' house, to the library. And one season I came home and I was really stunned to see that there were red maple leaves on the back of all the spines in the library that were Canadian books, which I kept thinking, would this ever happen in the United States, to put a flag on an American book? Maybe in the current United States it would. But I'm part of many particularisms, and not just Canada, but Jewishness. And I've always felt this paradox that it's only when you're steeped in a particular culture, language, vocabulary, calendar, that you can really understand many different kinds of people. It was one of the chief motivations in my writing my first novel to show that Jewishness itself was capacious enough and dramatic enough and passionate enough that you didn't have to leave the male stifling Yiddish suffocating immigrant neighborhoods to go find your shiksa goddess, that you could actually find your drama within. And I realize in listening to everyone here that Canada, it's in every book I've written. I wrote a memoir about a houseboat trip in Canada. A Woman's Book of Grieving has Canadian imagery and poems. And this book is set almost entirely in Canada. So I think you can leave, but you can't leave whatever's alive to you. That's where the imaginative writing comes from.
I'm just looking at the Q&A as we talk, as we wait for a moment.
I'm also looking at the time as we talk.
Yeah. So maybe should we get to our last question, David?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe some people don't have places to go. Maybe people do. I think would make sense to have the panel have its kind of roundness, and we can't just sort of stay and chat. There's 170 people here, but I think we should be respectful, of course, of our panelists' time as well. So I actually think maybe, Sarah, we have to skip our last one, even though it's super interesting. And I don't know. Or how can I poll everyone? Are we going to stay longer or what? I think we should. I think we should wrap. Carl, welcome, Carl Ehrlich.
Okay, thank you very much, David. On behalf of the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies here at York University, or at any rate, virtually here at York University, I'd like to thank everyone who participated in and attended this evening's excellent event. In particular, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists, David Bezmojis, Nessa Rappaport, Norman Raven, and Ayelet Tzabari for your excellent insights into the creative process. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Sarah Horowitz and David Kaufman, for organizing this event and leading it so ably, and for putting it together and inviting these great authors to share their insights with us. I'd like to thank our technical crew, Bert Ime and Grant McNair, who made sure that everything ran correctly. We professorial types, particularly in the humanities, are not known for our technical prowess, so we could never have done this without them. And last but certainly not least, I would like to thank our center's coordinator extraordinaire, Julie Feinberg, who is really the power behind the throne, and we couldn't do anything without her. Over the course of the last few years, York University and its Center for Jewish Studies has established itself as a center of Jewish literary creativity in Canada. Maybe not necessarily of its creation, but certainly of its propagation and dissemination. And certainly this evening's event has been part of this creative initiative, or this acknowledgement of the creative process that we have been running over the years. I was struck when listening to the discussion, particularly in the earlier part of the evening, that a number of our authors questioned the adjective historical in relationship to their fiction and their writing. Particularly since most of the authors spoke about how their writing deals with what they are familiar with. There's a autobiographical element to a lot of what they write, or they draw on their experience and knowledge. So I was reminded of a cartoon I saw recently, which was called At the Oxymoron Museum. And in this museum, it was a plan of a museum, and one of the rooms was labeled Current History. Luckily enough, the chair of my department is no longer with us here. He's a modern historian, as is David Kaufman. I don't know whether current history is an oxymoron, but certainly I think a number of our authors this evening seemed to be leaning somewhat in that direction. I'd like to close with some well-known words taken from the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, Asot Sfarim Harbe Ein Ketz. So the making of many books is without end. As a member of the people of the book, I've always found that Kohelet's kvetching in this case is unwarranted. We never have enough books, and I'm very happy that all of our authors are so prolific and are continuing to write. And I must say, this evening has made clear for us, if it was not clear beforehand, that the future of Canadian Jewish fiction writing is in very, very capable hands. Thank you all for attending. Good night. Erev Tov, Laila Tov, Kol Tuv.
Okay. See you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.